The sun was sinking low, spilling soft gold across the narrow streets of the small town. In the heart of the neighborhood lived Ada, a gentle woman known for her laughter that felt like warm rain and her garden that seemed to smile at anyone who passed. Every morning, she would wake before the world stirred, tending to her plants, humming softly. Her home was simple but filled with warmth, a place where stories gathered like friends. Next door lived Amaka. She was striking, with a smile that drew people in and eyes that seemed to hide secrets. Everyone admired her charm, but no one could say what lay beneath. Her house was always polished, her clothes crisp, and her words smooth. She carried herself like someone who knew her worth, yet there was something about her that whispered of careful design, a constant crafting of image. The two women had been neighbors for years, sharing greetings over fences, exchanging pleasantries, and occasionally borrowing a cup of sugar. But something had begun to shift. Ada had won the heart of her community through quiet kindness, but Amaka watched with growing envy. She noticed the way visitors lingered at Ada's doorstep, how her garden became a place for laughter and comfort, how stories about Ada spread like gentle wind. Amaka began to wish for that same light to shine on her. One afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Amaka stopped by Ada's gate. She wore a dress in deep green that clung perfectly, and her voice was smooth as she complimented Ada's flowers. Ada smiled, offering her tea, and Amaka accepted, sitting in the shade, sipping slowly, her eyes scanning the garden. "I've been meaning to ask," Amaka began, her tone casual, "how do you keep everything so alive? Your flowers, your home, your spirit." Ada laughed softly, brushing soil from her hands. "I just care," she said simply. "It's not magic, Amaka. I put myself into it." Amaka's smile deepened, but there was a glimmer of something unreadable in her eyes. "That's exactly what I want," she said quietly. "To care like you do. People notice you." Ada only nodded, unaware of the seed planting quietly in Amaka's mind. That evening, Amaka stayed late, walking through Ada's garden after Ada had gone inside. She touched the flowers, inhaled their scent, and whispered to herself. It wasn't admiration alone, there was a hunger there, something sharp and quiet. She wanted the laughter, the respect, the glow that seemed to follow Ada everywhere. She wanted to bury herself in that same light, to make it hers. And so, without Ada knowing, Amaka began to change her approach. She started visiting Ada more often, asking questions, offering small gifts. At first, it seemed like kindness, but beneath it, Amaka was learning. Every word Ada spoke, every smile she gave, every story she shared, Amaka took note. She began to weave her own charm with careful precision, borrowing Ada's laughter, her mannerisms, even the soft way she greeted people. Slowly, the neighborhood began to notice. Amaka's home became brighter, her smile softer, her presence warmer. People started to stop longer at her gate, linger in conversation. By the time the next market day arrived, whispers began to spread. "Have you seen how Amaka has changed? She has such warmth now. Her home feels alive." Ada noticed too, though she thought it was sweet, seeing her neighbor bloom. She welcomed the attention Amaka received, not sensing that something darker was growing alongside it. That night, Amaka sat alone by her window, watching the lights of the town flicker. She smiled to herself, her thoughts turning quiet and deep. She wasn't just admiring Ada anymore. She wanted what Ada had, and she was ready to take it. In that quiet moment, a plan began to form. The morning after, the air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and dew. Ada woke early as always. Her hands instinctively went to her garden, brushing through the leaves and petals as if greeting old friends. She hummed softly, her heart light with nothing but the simplicity of the day. Outside her gate, the street was slowly coming to life, women calling greetings, children laughing as they ran barefoot along the dusty road, vendors setting out their wares. Amaka was already awake. Her house was quiet, but inside, her mind was alive with schemes. She sat at her small veranda with a steaming cup of tea, her fingers wrapped around the mug. Her eyes lingered toward Ada's house. She watched her neighbor tending her garden, moving with ease and warmth that seemed effortless. But Amaka was careful. She did not want to rush the process. To capture what Ada had, she knew she had to learn it piece by piece, scene by scene, word by word. That day, Amaka found herself at Ada's doorstep again. She carried a basket of ripe yams wrapped in fresh banana leaves and offered them with an easy smile. Ada welcomed her with genuine delight, her laugh spilling like sunlight. They spoke of the market, of the weather, of simple things. Yet beneath their words, a quiet tension settled. Amaka was listening not just to what Ada said, but how she said it. She began visiting more often. Morning became their shared time. Amaka would come over with small offerings, fresh fruit, a pot of stew, handmade cloth she claimed she thought Ada might like. Ada received them with grace, never questioning the frequency. She enjoyed the company. But Amaka's visits were not purely acts of neighborly kindness, they were rehearsals. Amaka began to take notes in her own way. She noticed the way Ada greeted each passerby with genuine attention, how she made everyone feel they mattered. She noticed how Ada did not seek praise but gave it freely. Slowly, Amaka began practicing those gestures, adding them to her own manner. She changed how she dressed, choosing colors that felt warm and inviting. She adjusted her tone, softening it when she spoke to children, offering laughter that sounded like joy rather than performance. People began to notice. One afternoon, a group of neighbors gathered under the shade of a tree nearby, talking quietly while Ada tended her flowers. Amaka joined them, offering sweet water from a clay pot. They welcomed her presence, drawn to her growing warmth. The laughter around her felt different now, more sincere, or so she let them believe. Ada watched from her garden. She felt no suspicion, only a quiet sense that Amaka was becoming closer. She was glad for the company. Ada had never imagined that her neighbor might be working toward something more. Days passed. Amaka began to plant her own small garden. She borrowed tips from Ada, and her flowers began to bloom. It was no coincidence Amaka chose every seed carefully, modeling her own space after Ada's. The resemblance became noticeable. People began to whisper again, though this time with curiosity rather than admiration. Amaka smiled when she heard those whispers. It meant her work was taking root. But she knew this was only the beginning. What she wanted was not just to share Ada's light but to hold it entirely. One evening, as the last glow of sunlight faded, Amaka stood at her veranda, looking across the street at Ada's home. She thought about the laughter, the respect, the way people gathered around Ada. Her own reflection in the window seemed sharper somehow, full of intent. Her heart beat with quiet determination. She began to plan not just for charm, not just for admiration, but for a moment that would belong entirely to her. And so, beneath the calm of the night, the seed of a deeper scheme took root in her mind, one that would change both their lives forever. The morning broke soft and warm, with the sun spilling gentle light over the narrow street. The air was still heavy with the scent of earth, of fresh rain from the night before. Ada rose early, as always, her hands moving naturally toward the garden. It was her sanctuary, a place where she felt grounded, where her thoughts could wander without fear. She hummed quietly as she worked, her bare feet touching the cool soil. Across the street, Amaka was already awake. Her eyes were fixed not on the rising sun but on Ada's home. She had been watching her neighbor for weeks now, memorizing the rhythm of her days, the soft hums in the morning, the careful tending to plants, the laughter with passers-by. Amaka had learned that Ada's charm was not in grand gestures but in consistency, in a quiet presence that made people feel cared for without knowing why. That day, Amaka approached Ada with a plate of sweet yam cakes. She carried them in a basket lined with cloth, her smile effortless. Ada welcomed her warmly, inviting her to sit in the shade of the small veranda. They spoke softly at first about the weather, the state of the market, the little dramas of the neighborhood. Amaka listened closely, not just to Ada's words but to the pauses, the laughter between sentences, the tone she used. She began to notice how Ada's kindness was never loud but deeply deliberate. Every greeting, every smile was a choice. In the days that followed, Amaka became a frequent presence at Ada's gate. She would drop by with small gifts, a bundle of fresh herbs, a pot of stew, a woven basket. To the outside world, it seemed like simple neighborliness. But for Amaka, these visits were lessons, rehearsals for a performance she was crafting in secret. She began to mirror Ada's gestures. Her laughter grew softer and warmer. She learned to greet people with names, to remember small details about their lives. Slowly, she shaped herself into something more than a neighbor. She shaped herself into a presence people wanted to be near. Neighbors began to notice. At the small market on the corner, they would whisper about how Amaka seemed different. Her clothes were brighter, her smile softer, her home welcoming in a way it had never been. Some admired her. Others wondered quietly why. But Amaka let the whispers feed her. Each word, each glance was fuel for her growing confidence. One afternoon, Amaka invited herself to Ada's garden under the pretense of learning. Ada welcomed her with ease, showing her how to tend the flowers, how to encourage growth with patience. Amaka watched, asked questions, and slowly began to make notes in her own mind. She pictured herself living in Ada's world, capturing the warmth that seemed to surround her neighbor. She started tending her own little garden with care, planting blooms she had seen Ada nurture. Each flower became a piece of her growing mimicry, a step closer to becoming the version of herself she longed to be. As the weeks passed, her presence in the neighborhood shifted. People lingered longer when they spoke to her. Children ran to greet her. Even strangers would smile when she passed. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but the change was real. Ada noticed it too, though she felt no suspicion. She thought it was sweet that Amaka was finding joy in tending her own space, in becoming part of the life that surrounded them. Ada did not see that Amaka was building something far deeper than friendship. She was building her own shadow of Ada's light. One evening, Amaka stood at her window after everyone had gone to sleep. The street was quiet, lit only by the glow of lamps. Her eyes lingered on Ada's home across the way. She thought about the laughter that gathered there, the respect Ada carried without asking for it, the way her home seemed to hold stories. A slow, quiet smile formed on Amaka's lips. She knew the work she had done was only the beginning. She would not just borrow Ada's light, she would claim it. Beneath the calm of that night, her mind began to weave a deeper, darker plan, one that would not simply imitate Ada but erase her entirely from the story of the neighborhood. The next morning rose heavy and quiet. The air carried a thick warmth, the kind that makes everything slow down, and the town seemed to move in soft rhythms. Ada woke with the first light, her hands instinctively reaching for the garden, her fingers brushing over damp petals as she walked barefoot across the cool earth. Her mind was peaceful, unaware that her neighbor was already awake, weaving a plan that grew sharper with each passing day. Amaka spent the morning differently. She did not hurry to the garden. Instead, she sat at her veranda with a cup of tea, her eyes drawn toward Ada's house. Her thoughts were not on the morning itself but on the careful steps she had taken so far. She had studied Ada's presence, mirrored her gestures, and gathered whispers from the neighborhood. People now spoke of her with curiosity and warmth. But Amaka knew she could not stop here. To truly claim what Ada had, she needed something more, a moment that would change everything. By midday, Amaka found her way to Ada's garden again. She carried with her a basket filled with small things she had gathered, sweet yam cakes wrapped in banana leaves, a bunch of fresh herbs, and a piece of cloth dyed in warm earth tones. Her smile was effortless when Ada greeted her, and Ada, as always, welcomed her without suspicion. They spoke softly, as though guarding their words. Amaka asked Ada about the plants, how she knew when each needed water, when to trim, when to let grow freely. Ada shared her knowledge without hesitation, her voice gentle, full of patience. Amaka drank in each word. But this was not just about flowers anymore, it was about understanding the rhythm of Ada's world so she could make it her own. Amaka began to weave herself deeper into Ada's life. She lingered longer in the garden, offering to help even when it was not needed. She made small gestures, carrying Ada's basket from the market, bringing extra fruits she said she thought Ada might enjoy. To Ada, it was kindness. To Amaka, it was practice. Slowly, Amaka began changing the way she moved through the neighborhood. She greeted people with Ada's warmth, asked after their days with sincere interest, remembered the smallest details about their lives. Neighbors began to notice. Amaka has changed, they would whisper. She carries herself differently now. Some admired it. Others wondered quietly why. Amaka welcomed every whisper, every curious glance. It fed her ambition. One afternoon, she invited herself to Ada's veranda under the guise of wanting to learn more about the garden. Ada, as always, welcomed her. They sat together, fingers brushing soil, laughter soft between them. Amaka paid close attention not just to Ada's words, but to her rhythm, the pauses, the quiet moments between conversation where charm lived. She began to mimic those pauses in her own speech, shaping her own presence to match Ada's natural grace. Amaka's own garden began to change. She planted flowers she had learned Ada loved. She tended them daily, watching them bloom as if each petal was a step toward her deeper aim. Slowly, she built her own space that mirrored Ada's warmth. It was during one of these afternoons that Amaka began speaking to herself softly, almost like a vow. She would not stop until she had what Ada had: the light, the laughter, the respect that followed her neighbor wherever she went. But Amaka wanted more. She wanted to bury Ada's place in people's hearts so deeply that only she would remain. That evening, under the dim glow of her veranda light, Amaka traced her plan quietly in her mind. She imagined a scene where she would stand in the center of the neighborhood's admiration. Where Ada's warmth would no longer be the brightest flame. She knew it would not be quick. It would take patience. It would take careful steps. And most of all, it would take charm. And Amaka was ready to give them all. The morning came slow and soft, the kind of morning where the world feels still before it wakes. Ada rose with the sun, her bare feet touching the earth as if greeting it. The garden called to her quietly, as it always did, and she answered without thought, humming softly to herself. Her neighbors stirred somewhere beyond the walls of her home, their voices rising faintly through the air. To Ada, it was a world of simple rhythms, laughter, greetings, work, and care. Across the narrow street, Amaka was already awake, though her morning was far from simple. She did not rush to the garden. Instead, she sat in her small veranda with a cup of tea, staring across the street at Ada's home. Her fingers curled tightly around the cup, not for warmth but for focus. Her mind was alive with the threads of her plan, and each moment felt like another stitch she must weave with care. For weeks now, Amaka had been practicing her role. She had studied Ada, learned her mannerisms, the way she carried herself without effort. But she knew that imitation alone would not be enough. What she wanted was to surpass Ada, to replace her quietly in the hearts of the people. And for that, she needed something stronger, a story of her own, woven from truth and deception. That morning, she crossed the street carrying a basket of yams, wrapped neatly in fresh leaves. She greeted Ada with a smile so soft it almost seemed accidental, and Ada returned it without hesitation, inviting her in. They sat together under the veranda, the air filled with the scent of herbs and earth. Amaka spoke of the day ahead, of the market, of small village tales. But beneath her words, there was purpose. She asked questions not out of curiosity but to harvest details, the way Ada's eyes lit when speaking of her garden, the way her voice softened when she talked about her neighbors. Amaka began to visit more frequently, her visits stretching longer each time. She brought gifts not out of kindness but strategy, a clay pot of stew, a bunch of fresh herbs, cloth dyed in gentle colors. Ada accepted them with warmth, never questioning the pattern. For her, it was companionship. For Amaka, it was training. She began to mirror Ada's gestures in subtle ways. When Ada laughed, she practiced laughing the same way. When Ada bent to tend her flowers, she bent similarly in her own garden. Her clothing began to shift toward the colors Ada wore, her tone softening in conversation. Slowly, Amaka was building her own charm, not as herself, but as a reflection of Ada. The neighborhood began to notice. At the market, women would whisper about how Amaka seemed different, how her smile had changed, how her voice carried warmth. Children ran to her when she walked by. Strangers would greet her with nods. Amaka welcomed their attention, storing it as fuel for the deeper part of her plan. One afternoon, she approached Ada's garden with something in mind. She carried a small notebook, disguised under the excuse of wanting to learn more about the plants. Ada welcomed her as always, showing her the delicate process of tending flowers, explaining patience as if it were a lesson to live by. Amaka watched closely, not just listening but observing every motion, every pause, every unspoken moment where Ada's charm lived. In her own home, Amaka's garden became a mirror of Ada's. She planted blooms in the same order, tended them with the same careful touch. Each flower that opened was a small victory, a piece of her plan taking root. But the changes inside Amaka were deeper. She was no longer just practicing charm, she was becoming it. That evening, when the street had fallen quiet, Amaka sat in her veranda, her hands resting lightly over her knees. Her mind replayed each step she had taken, each gesture she had learned. She smiled quietly, not at the beauty of her garden, but at the thought of the plan growing within her. She began to speak softly to herself, as though confessing her ambition to the night. She would not simply take Ada's place. She would erase her entirely. She imagined herself standing at the center of the neighborhood's admiration, the story of Ada fading until only Amaka remained. The thought made her heart beat steady and slow. She knew she had to move carefully now, planting not only flowers but moments of influence. A smile here, a kind word there, a gesture that would linger in memory. Amaka's visits to Ada's garden grew more frequent. She lingered longer in conversation, speaking of dreams and hopes in a voice that seemed to mirror Ada's own softness. People began to see them together more often, and some began to whisper of friendship, of a bond growing between them. But Amaka did not see it as friendship. She saw it as an opportunity. One day, she brought a small clay pot filled with stew she claimed her grandmother had taught her to make. Ada accepted it gratefully, and they sat together long into the afternoon, talking of gardens and life and kindness. Amaka listened with intent, but her mind wandered toward the moments ahead, the moments she was crafting where her story would eclipse Ada's. That night, Amaka stayed awake later than usual. She moved quietly to her veranda, where the street was dim and hushed. Across the way, Ada's home glowed faintly in the evening light. Amaka's gaze lingered there, her lips forming a slow, quiet smile. She knew now the plan was no longer just in her mind. It had begun to breathe, to grow, and soon it would bloom. Her ambition no longer felt hidden. It was alive. The morning came quietly, with the kind of light that made everything look soft, as if the world had been brushed in gold. Ada woke early, as she always did, her bare feet touching the cool earth before she even opened her eyes. She moved toward the garden without thought, her hands brushing over the leaves as if greeting old friends. Her world was calm, built of small joys, the scent of fresh soil, the laughter of a child passing by, the warmth of a neighbor's greeting. But across the narrow street, Amaka began her morning differently. She was awake before dawn, seated quietly at her veranda with a small cup of tea in her hands. The steam rose into the air, curling slowly in the dim light. Her eyes were fixed on Ada's home, tracing its shapes and shadows with intent. This morning, she was not simply watching. She was planning. She had learned patience. She had learned mimicry. Now she wanted precision. For weeks, Amaka had been weaving herself into Ada's life. She had learned the rhythm of her days, the gentle way she spoke, the way she moved without effort. Her visits to Ada's garden had become a ritual, moments of quiet observation disguised as friendship. But Amaka knew she had not yet reached the heart of her ambition. She needed something deeper, something powerful enough to make her name the one that lingered in the mouths of the neighborhood. That morning, Amaka crossed the street carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were gifts, freshly picked fruits, a pot of stew she had prepared herself, a few fragrant flowers from her own garden. Her smile was soft but purposeful when Ada greeted her, as though she had rehearsed every moment. Ada welcomed her warmly, as always, and Amaka stepped in with practiced grace. They sat together under Ada's veranda, speaking in quiet tones. Ada talked about the new flowers blooming in her garden, about the children who played nearby, about the market that was opening later that day. Amaka listened, nodding gently, her mind not just on the words but on the way Ada spoke them. Each pause, each gesture was a lesson. Days stretched into weeks, and Amaka's visits became longer. She lingered in the garden under the pretense of learning, touching leaves with the same care Ada showed, asking questions not for knowledge but for closeness. She brought small gifts without fail, a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a cloth dyed in soft tones. To Ada, it was kindness. To Amaka, it was strategy. Her own home began to change as well. She tended her garden with a deliberate hand, planting the flowers Ada loved most. Each blossom became a step in her silent plan. Her home began to look more like Ada's, quiet, warm, inviting. People noticed. They began to speak differently to her, with curiosity and warmth. Children ran to greet her in the street. Strangers smiled. And Amaka stored each moment like treasure, feeding her ambition. One afternoon, she asked Ada to teach her more about tending flowers, about patience and care. Ada welcomed her with a soft smile. They worked side by side in the garden, their hands in soil. Amaka watched Ada closely, the way her eyes softened, the quiet rhythm of her voice, the small laughter that slipped between words. She began to practice these things herself, shaping her presence with care. It was no longer mimicry. It was transformation. Amaka was becoming a shadow of Ada's light, a version of her that could stand in place without anyone noticing. And yet, she wanted more. She wanted Ada's place in the hearts of the people, and she was willing to bury her neighbor's glory entirely to claim it. That night, Amaka sat in her veranda, staring quietly at Ada's home. The street was silent except for the distant murmur of voices and the rustle of leaves. Her mind replayed every step she had taken, every small gesture she had made to weave herself into the life of the neighborhood. Her lips curved into a quiet smile. She was no longer just practicing. The plan had begun to breathe. It was no longer something she carried in her mind but something alive, growing stronger in her hands. She imagined herself in the days ahead, standing at the heart of the neighborhood, admired and cherished. She saw Ada's light dimming quietly while hers grew brighter, until she stood alone. The thought filled her with a steady determination. She knew the work ahead would require subtlety, patience, and careful charm. But she was ready. She would not rush. She would not falter. Every smile, every gesture, every whispered kindness would be another step toward her goal. And in that quiet night, with the street sleeping around her, Amaka began to weave the next part of her plan, one that would not just borrow Ada's warmth but bury it entirely, so that when the people looked for her light, they would find only Amaka. The morning arrived like a hush. The air was thick with heat, and the faint sound of roosters crowing drifted softly across the small lane. Ada woke before the sun fully rose, the kind of early where the world still feels untouched. She slipped from her bed quietly, as if not to disturb the peace of her home, and walked barefoot toward her garden. Her palms brushed over cool leaves, her breath slowing to the rhythm of the earth. The scent of fresh soil filled her senses. This was her place of calm, her silent prayer to life. Amaka had already been awake for some time. She sat in her veranda with a small cup of warm tea, her eyes fixed on Ada's home as if studying something sacred. Her fingers curled tightly around the cup, though the tea was already cold. Her thoughts were not about the morning or the light. They were on strategy. Every move she had made so far was a step in her plan, and the next one was forming in her mind with careful precision. For months, She had woven herself deeper into Ada's world. Every visit, every conversation, every small gesture was a part of her growing web. She had learned the way Ada spoke without effort, the quiet confidence in her tone, the way her laughter lingered. Amaka had mirrored it all, shaping her own presence to match Ada's charm. But now she was ready to move beyond mimicry. She needed influence, something that would not only draw attention but claim it completely. That morning, she crossed the street with a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside were carefully chosen things: ripe fruits, a small pot of stew simmered the night before, and a few stems of flowers she had grown herself. Her smile was measured, warm, as though it came without effort, and Ada greeted her with the same ease she always did. They sat together under Ada's veranda, speaking quietly. Ada talked about the new blooms in her garden, about the market, about the children who played nearby. Amaka listened closely, nodding softly, letting her gaze rest on Ada in quiet attention. But inside, she was cataloguing every detail. Every pause, every tone, every gesture was a piece of her plan. From that morning, Amaka's visits grew longer, richer. She lingered over conversations, brought gifts without expectation of return, offered help that Ada politely accepted. It was more than companionship now. It was practice for a deeper game. Amaka began to weave her presence into the life of the neighborhood. She greeted people with a warmth she had learned from Ada, asked after their families with sincere curiosity, remembered details that others overlooked. Slowly, the air around her began to shift. People began to notice. Some admired her. Others whispered, wondering quietly what had changed. But all noticed. She shaped her own garden to mirror Ada's. Flowers bloomed under her care in patterns she knew would catch the eye. She wore colors that seemed to carry Ada's gentle grace. Her voice softened when speaking to neighbors. Children began to run toward her when she passed by. Strangers smiled at her in the street. And Amaka stored each moment, every nod of recognition, every warm word, as if building the foundation for something greater. One afternoon, Amaka invited herself to Ada's garden with a notebook hidden under her arm. She claimed she wanted to record the lessons Ada shared about flowers, about soil, about care. Ada welcomed her with the easy kindness she gave everyone. They sat together in the sun, fingers brushing leaves, their voices low and gentle. Amaka watched Ada carefully, studying her rhythm, her pauses, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of something she loved. It was no longer just imitation. Amaka was becoming Ada, or at least the version of her that would stand taller in the eyes of the people. And yet, Amaka's ambition burned deeper. She wanted more than to be like Ada. She wanted Ada's place, her recognition, her light buried so completely that no one would remember who had come first. That evening, Amaka stayed in her veranda long after the street had gone quiet. She stared across at Ada's home, where light still glowed faintly from inside. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, her thoughts moving like threads weaving themselves together. She had reached a point now where patience was no longer enough. She needed influence. She needed a moment that would change everything. She began to speak softly to herself, almost as if confessing to the night. She imagined herself standing at the center of the neighborhood's admiration. She saw Ada's warmth fading slowly while hers grew, until she was the one people spoke of in hushed, admiring tones. Amaka began to plan not just her next visit, but her next move. She would not simply be a shadow of Ada's light. She would eclipse it. And the steps she needed to take would be careful, deliberate, and filled with charm. The night deepened, and Amaka remained in her veranda. The air was heavy and still, and somewhere far away, laughter rose softly. She smiled quietly, a smile that was not warmth but resolve. Her ambition had moved beyond thought. It had become action. And in the quiet dark, Amaka knew that the moment was coming when her work would be revealed and Ada's place in the hearts of the people would begin to vanish. The air that morning was heavy, almost restless. The sky was pale with early light, and even the breeze felt quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. Ada rose slowly, her body still carrying the weight of sleep, and moved toward her garden with careful steps. Her hands slid over the leaves as though greeting old friends, and she breathed in deeply, savoring the moment of peace before the day truly began. The street beyond her garden was waking quietly, the voices of vendors and the hum of distant life growing soft and warm. Across the lane, Amaka was already awake. Her veranda was shaded in early light, but her eyes were bright, fixed on Ada's home as if studying it for the last time before her plan came to its turning point. Her heart was steady, but inside there was a quiet excitement, the kind that comes before change. Every morning she had spent weaving her way into Ada's life had been preparation for what now seemed inevitable. Her visits had grown longer, her conversations warmer, her smiles more effortless. The neighborhood had begun to see her differently. She was no longer the woman who simply lived nearby. She had become a presence people noticed, sought, admired. And she had learned to carry herself with the same quiet grace Ada carried, except now it was her own, polished and perfected. But Amaka was not satisfied with imitation anymore. She wanted ownership. Not just admiration, but possession. She wanted Ada's place in the neighborhood's heart to be hers, and she had begun to understand that the way to claim it was not through force, but through a slow, quiet unraveling. That day, she came to Ada's home carrying something unusual, a small basket of carefully wrapped packages. Ada greeted her with the usual warmth, unaware that this visit was different. They sat together, and Amaka placed the basket between them, her hands lingering as if reluctant to let go. Inside were small treasures, hand-stitched cloths, jars of honey, sweet pastries she had baked herself. Each gift was chosen with a careful thought. They were not just gifts, they were gestures that spoke without words, a way to weave herself even deeper into Ada's life and the lives of those around them. They spoke quietly, Ada telling stories of her childhood, of how her own mother had taught her to tend a garden, of how she had learned the quiet joy of giving without expecting. Amaka listened with an intentness that seemed genuine, though behind it was calculation. She noted the pauses in Ada's speech, the glances toward the street, the way Ada's eyes softened when she spoke of kindness. The afternoon stretched long, and Amaka lingered. She offered to help Ada with the garden, to prepare tea, to bring more flowers for the veranda. Ada accepted with gratitude, unaware that each act of kindness was another step toward her own undoing. As the days passed, Amaka's presence became something the neighborhood no longer questioned. She was there for every small moment, the greetings in the morning, the help in the market, the quiet offering of gifts. People began to speak of her with admiration, seeking her out for advice, smiling when she passed. Her garden bloomed richly, not by accident but by deliberate design, mirroring Ada's in ways no one could mistake. Amaka began to host small gatherings in her home, inviting neighbors for tea, offering small performances of kindness that became stories in themselves. She made sure that every word, every gesture, every visit was remembered. Slowly, Ada's place began to fade in their minds. One evening, as the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, Amaka stood on her veranda, looking across at Ada's home. Ada was inside, tending her own flowers, unaware of the changes taking place. Amaka smiled quietly to herself. Her plan was near completion. She began speaking softly to the air, as though confessing to the night. She imagined the moment when the neighborhood would speak of her as they once spoke of Ada, with warmth, admiration, a touch of awe. She imagined her name becoming the one that lived in every conversation. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet shift became undeniable. People came to Amaka for advice and kindness more often than they came to Ada. Ada still tended her garden, still offered her smiles, but her light was dimming without her even noticing. Amaka's gatherings became more frequent. Her home became a place people sought. And each time she welcomed someone in, her smile carried the weight of her victory. She was not just admired anymore, she was desired. Her presence had become something the neighborhood could not let go of. The moment came quietly. It was during one of Amaka's gatherings, a warm afternoon filled with laughter and conversation. A neighbor mentioned how kind Amaka was, how she had come into their lives and brought warmth. Others nodded, and no one mentioned Ada. It was the kind of moment that was not loud but was decisive. Amaka felt the quiet thrill of triumph. She had not stolen with force, nor with loud confrontation. She had stolen Ada's place with charm, patience, and subtle care. She had buried Ada's glory without anyone realizing it was gone. That night, as the village slept, Amaka stood in her veranda again. Her eyes rested on Ada's home, now dim and quiet. Her lips curved in a slow smile. The work was complete. She had taken what she wanted without breaking the surface, without a single loud confrontation. In her heart, she knew the victory was sweeter because it had been so silent. And as the moon rose high above the street, casting a soft glow, Amaka whispered quietly to herself, a promise that no one would forget her name, not now, not ever. This story is a quiet reminder that hearts can be won, and glory can be taken, not with force, but with patience, charm, and a plan. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought without swords, only with whispers, gestures, and moments that change everything without anyone noticing. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made you feel something deep, don't forget to subscribe so you can follow more tales that stir the soul. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what your local time is right now. We want to connect with every one of you and share these moments together. Every story matters. And your voice matters too.